So, Kerry, hello.
Laura.
So, just to give people a bit of an idea about how we're going to talk about this fairly monstrous book. Wait a minute, that's not the right word.
What are you going to say about this fairly monstrous man?
No, we won't say that. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. We're going to talk a lot about the man, but there are so many interesting things about the nature and use of power in the book, which I think are really fascinating. And as a result, there's some really interesting reflections to make on current politics as well.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes. So maybe just very briefly to start, you could just talk about the quite unique structure of the book.
Well, when I started working on the television series, which was a 4-part series, 4 hours, but in fact we recorded about 16 hours to cut down to the 4, I honestly did not for more than a few minutes think about the prospect of following up with a book. I thought that we'd be able to pick the eyes out of it with the series, and anyway, my focus was so much on making that series work as that was as far as I took it in my mind. What Paul had in the back of his, I don't know at the time, but it worked so well, Laura, as a television series, and we had such a terrific response to it. And at the end, I had become so frustrated with what had figuratively hit the cutting room floor and particularly when the publishers lined up in expressing their interest, that I did think seriously for the first time about contemplating a book. And when I did, and I had a number of talks with Paul Keating about it, and he was similarly cautious, because obviously if I was going to do the book, it would mean spending more time with him again, so therefore required his cooperation. And part of it was thinking about, well, what would be the structure of the book, because it wasn't going to be a biography, and it certainly wasn't going to be an autobiography. All his own words and all his own work, with nary a challenge along the way. It was neither of those things. And there were no models for this, as there were no models for the television series, because I cannot think of a television series anywhere, really, where it was one talking head sustaining 4 whole hours. That is not the way television is viewed by most of its practitioners. Most television practitioners are very defensive about what they quaintly call talking heads. They believe that it doesn't take long for people's attention to wander, and so it has to be a riveting talking heads, so the mainstream thinking goes, to sustain any length of time with one person staring down the lens. I had more faith in it than that, in picking the right person to do it and having something to tell. So I did think that in the end it had to be an extension of the conversation, and I couldn't see a way past making the whole structure that of a conversation rather than me turning it into a biography or me ghosting an autobiography. The challenge then was to make it interesting, because frankly, if somebody told me that there was a 750 to 800 page book which was a book of transcripts of Q&A, I'd say send me the 2-page digest or I'll read the reviews. But I was agreeably surprised as it was unfolding and I had to go back again and again and review, because of course each time I would go back for another session, I wasn't just thinking about the next bunch of things that had to be covered. I was also looking back with a critical eye to maybe some questions I'd left unanswered, maybe something that I should have followed up on that I missed. But I found that each time I went back, I was still caught by it, which could sound like terrible egocentricity, except I'm not talking about my words, I'm talking about his. And I still was caught by it, and the same reaction was coming to me from the publishers.
Sorry, what do you mean by caught by it?
Well, I was caught by the words. I was caught by the content of what he was talking about. And what I mean, I would not have been interested in a kind of, in a drab chronological processing through this budget followed by the next budget followed by the next budget. Oh, and then he knocked Hawke off and then he became Prime Minister. The thing that interested me most, apart from from exploring that very important part of Australia's political and economic history, and to a degree social history, through the eyes of one of its key participants, was coming to a better understanding of one man's application of power. In Keating's case, what caught my attention, I think, from years ago, was that this bloke from a very early age had come looking for power, but came with a bank of reflection in his brain about what that power should be and what he wanted to do with it. And it comes through again and again, Laura. Not power for power's sake, but power and what you can do with it. Mm. So you can argue until the cows come home about whether he did the right things with that power or whether he abused the opportunities. What you can never accuse Keating of is not taking advantage of having the power to use it and to use it to change things. Mm.
So the big question, I suppose, that it poses is where did this guy come from? Mm. Where did this extraordinary combination of lust for power, if you like, but this sort of amalgam of ideas also? Mm.
Because he wasn't an educated person when he came to it. I mean, he certainly wasn't formally educated. And in this day and age, university for a young Paul Keating would be an absolute given. And I've had some interesting conversations with people who've argued over whether he would have been a better practitioner and a better leader if he'd come with the background discipline of a university education behind him, or whether in fact that would have constrained him. It's an interesting question and one that we'll never know, but other than finding a parallel universe. But I mean, it is fascinating. It's a kind of well-known story about the family background now, but to hear him articulate it, I think, is the trick. And to hear him reflect back on the nature of his relationship with his grandmother and his mother and his father, who were the three key people. And then there was that fourth person who had in his own way been a giant who became an embittered giant of the Labor movement, and that was Jack Lang. So even as he's in his last year of school and he and his mother are sitting with the obligatory person from the Department of Education who is talking with all the kids about vocation and what their vocation might be. And Paul says, well, he's thinking he might be an architect. Oh no, the vocational officer had said, on the background of what Paul had told him and what his school report said, perhaps he could be an architect or a panel beater. And Keating's mother, Min, said, well, actually, no. And there are two versions of this story. One is Paul would rather be Prime Minister, and the other version is, I think Paul would rather be Prime Minister. But that fascinating moment in the television interviews where he talks about how his grandmother put him on a pedestal, and he talked about the love quotient from both mother and grandmother, and how his grandmother vested this great kind of sense of confidence in him that allowed him, as he put it, to put on the asbestos suit to walk through the fire. But then he also contrasted his father's influence, who he described as a sweet guy, but who nonetheless had the political background, and his mother, who he described as a killer. And clearly the sort of the more naked ambition in the family came from Mum, who at one point was castigating Dad, Matt, to get out of his Boilermaker's outfit and go out and start his own business. And Matt and two other tradies actually did that. They started their own engineering business, ended up with 100 or more people working for them, and it actually became a really quite successful mid-engineering building in the western suburbs, business in the western suburbs of Sydney. So he learns the political stuff from his father, but clearly the ambition came from Mum and Grandmum.
Well, he learns the political ideas, if you like, and he gets the ambition. But where does, one of the things about Keating, which was extraordinary, was, and we'll talk about this further, I hope, was his grip on people.
Yeah.
That he has this, a way of both sizing people up, charming if he wants to, terrifying them. I mean, where do those skills come from? Are they innate, or are they something that he's learnt from the old school of politics?
I'd say a combination of things. I mean, I think largely driven by the essential nature and personality of... I mean, the personality's made up of a lot of environmental factors, but partly it does spring from the nature of Paul Keating. But also, you see, I mean, if you actually get down to the kind of psychoanalysis of the man, I'd say definitely an introvert more than an extrovert. I think private space is incredibly important to this guy. I think time for reflection was a feature of his time in public life, which is very hard, as you would know, for any politician who's holding down any sort of serious job in government. The people who are endlessly traipsing through your office, the amount of time you have to spend getting across and staying across your brief, formulating new policy with all of it running departments. But those things were incredibly important to him. But then there was the influence of Jack Lang, and I think that can be overestimated, but I wouldn't underestimate it either. This is fascinating to me about this guy. He goes knocking on Jack Lang, cold calls Jack Lang at the age of about 18. By this time, Lang is in his late 80s. He's a crusty old bugger. I remembered when I worked on 7:30, one of my colleagues did a profile, a story on what Jack Lang was up to, and by this stage, here he is. He's alienated from his own party, which had been much of his life, and he's still turning up at his office in the city every day, and he was writing his own newspaper called Century. And it was all full of his ideas about the present and the future. And Keating goes knocking on his door and says, "Hi, I'm Paul Keating, Mr. Lang, and I want to talk about politics and power, and I want to tap your brain, basically." And they forge this relationship, as he says, a very formal one, where he calls him Mr. Lang, and Lang calls this 18, 19-year-old kid with a sort of a fuzz on his cheeks, calls him Mr. Keating. But you can tell that the way he describes Lang, the figure, the physical presence of Lang, he comes to life. These long arms that reach out to you like a sort of comic book concertina character, and how his piercing gaze as he would talk to Keating about the nature of power. And things like, think of politics as a two-horse race, and in that race you would always back the horse called self-interest. You're not anything in politics, and you've got a decent stable of enemies, Mr. Keating. You might think you've got time, but you haven't got a second to lose, Mr. Keating. I mean, these are the kinds of things that he was learning, not at the knee, but across the table from Jack Lang. And you're not going to learn about power in a university, Mr. Keating. No course at university is going to teach you about the nature of power.
So this was a particularly intense early relationship in politics. Now, you would have known Keating in the 70s when he first came to Canberra. And the extraordinary thing about him is when you get to talk to him, he does have this treasure trove of people who he's collected over the years. And despite what you say about him being an introvert, he has these quite intense relationships with a lot of people over the course of his life, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Lang was a classic example. Rex Connor was another. Rex was another sort of big, raw Labor figure from the Whitlam years, who was Whitlam's Minerals and Energy Minister. Many of you, I look out and I can see that many of you would remember the Kemlani, the Loans affair, Tirith Kemlani.
What are you saying,
Some of the
Kerry?
madnesses of that era. And Rex Connor, at midnight in his office alone, waiting for the telex to come from this mad, bad little man, saying that the loans had come through and his political dream was going to be rescued. And of course, it was a sad and lonely dream that ended up with his forced resignation. And ironically, again, the mentor, the student, the protege who had been turning up to listen and learn from Rex Connor, Paul Keating, takes his job. One of the many ironies of politics. But there were many others. I mean, he, in those early years, one of the ones that interested me most actually was there was a very patrician, silver-haired suave kind of senior public service figure from the Menzies era, a guy named Sir John Bunting, who he'd run various departments, but most particularly Prime Minister and Cabinet. And a lot of these but a kind of nucleus of these senior public servants used to meet at the Commonwealth Club, I think it was, in Canberra on a regular basis. And so Keating picks up on this, and occasionally he would actually book himself in and stay there. And he would not so much ingratiate himself, but he made himself known particularly to Bunting. I mean, these were the real power figures in the Menzies era. People like Sir Arthur Tang and others. Tang was Defence, Fred Wheeler was Treasury, and they essentially, largely, ran government in those days. So Keating made it his business to get to know Bunting, and as he quite frankly says, I wanted to know how that part of the power equation worked. And so he did. And he tells a story of when Jim Cairns, who was one of the more passionate people, again, of the Whitlam era, and a kind of iconic figure of Labor's and the sort of father of the anti-Vietnam moratoria, which drew hundreds of thousands of protesters in the Vietnam War years. And Jim Cairns, I was going to say accosted him in the toilet once in Parliament House, that's not quite the word. No. But as he passed him, let's say at the toilet door, said to him, "Where's your moratorium badge, Paul?" And Paul said, "Jim, I'm not here to protest. I'm here to get power and run things." And you may find that engaging, you may find that off-putting, the naked frankness of it. But this was all part of the view, the Keating view, which was, I don't have a second to lose, and I suppose you could translate that to, we don't have a second to lose.
One thing I'm not clear about is, was there, in terms of, I mean, as he says himself, some of Keating's great moments in the Parliament are still YouTube sensations today. You know, they're famous.
Hundreds of thousands of hits. It's quite extraordinary.
Because mate, I'm going to do you slowly. All those.
Yeah.
All those hymns.
Shiver looking for a spine to run up.
Well, there's it.
I want to see more of those ashen-faced performances.
Yes, all those things. But I mean, there was Rex Connor, there was Jack Lang, but there wasn't really anybody specific, was there, who he learnt parliamentary things from? I mean, probably Fred.
Oh no, I think you have to say he was an original in a lot of regards. I mean, look, I think there are several things that are key to understanding Keating. One, I think he had a driving curiosity that was never going to be sated, and I think that was matched by imagination. I think curiosity and imagination are two great keys to understanding Keating, and I think they are two things big things that help make him the interesting figure he became. And another is that I think to understand this guy, you also have to see him as a warrior. He could be a very charming, and I think by nature, if you were to meet him outside politics and you were not his political enemy, his perceived political enemy, he could engage you in a very charming, sincerely charming way. But if you came at him as a political enemy, then he would be remorseless and he would be merciless. And his was a take-no-prisoners kind of approach. And when you look through the book and you hear him speak, you'll be struck at times. I mean, you'd be convinced, really, on the face of things, that he actually has a hatred for John Howard, for instance, that he despises John Howard. Howard is his hated enemy, and yet there are moments in the book, one where he says that he absolutely accepts and respects the fact that Howard was sincere about his commitment to public life and to public service. I mean, he sees himself that way too, but he's putting Howard on that same platform and saying, I respect the man for this. And yet in the next breath, he can write him off as a quote-unquote little white picket fence racist. And you think, well, hang on, you know, how can you say you respect this guy and then say that about him? Well, I think that is an honest statement, and I think that is the political warrior speaking. The same man who he was talking about his relationship with Bill Clinton, and we'll come to that later, but he said that when he was telling me some of the conversations he had with Clinton, he said he loved me talking political dirty talk. He said he loved me talking dirty. And I said, what did you mean by talking dirty? He said, we were in Bogor in Indonesia for the second Apec summit, and Clinton. He said, Clinton told me, I'm really here to hear from you how Labor and how you have managed to keep beating the Conservatives in the way you have, because he was knee deep in Newt Gingrich and Gingrich's attempt to freeze the budget process, and Keating had said to him. Keating said, I said to him, you know, Bill, you've got to rip the throat out of your Republicans. Rip their throats out. He said, when Howard came to the leadership of the Liberals, and someone in the office said, he's not going to be easy to beat. He said, I'm going to put an axe through his chest and rip his ribs open. And I, looking, and he said, that's what I mean by political dirty talk.
Well, let's talk. We want to go to a lot of these things, but one of the relationships, two relationships which are really surprising to me out of the book, one of them is the way he talks about Howard, because there's also that clinical edge to it, which is, he's, as you say, there's the warrior who's going to, rip this guy's lungs out and split his ribs and things, and then there's the absolutely pragmatic assessment of what this guy is, what he represents, and therefore what Paul Keating has to do to beat him. But the thing that surprised me the most, in a way, was the much more complex relationship that is reflected with Bob Hawke, because most people would think that they ended up loathing each other, that Keating was contemptuous of Hawke and vice versa, and that's not what comes out at all.
No. And it was a really interesting part of the process. I mean, this is the longest single continuous conversation I've ever had in my life. And since I'm now 70, it's the longest I'll ever have. But I think Keating regarded the friendship that they were unlikely friends in the early days of the Hawke government, because prior to that, they'd had little to do with each other. And in Keating's terms, he was perfectly happy with that. He saw Hawke as this somewhat rude character, particularly if he was on the piss, if I could put it like that. And he thought, well, Bob, I'm happy for you to run your race with the trade unions, and I'm happy to be part of this process because one day I'm going to run it. He had Bill Hayden by this stage as his leader after Gough had gone. And Hawke comes in 1981, but there's a certain amount of circling, or 1980, there's a certain amount of circling that's going on around the place, and Bob's allies in the trade union movement are coming to Keating and saying, you two need to get together. In particular, it was Barry Unsworth, who ran the Labor Council in New South Wales. They were all on the right, and Keating's reluctant, but eventually they come together and they have their first significant conversation in which essentially Bob Hawke is already saying to Paul Keating, when I become party leader, blah, 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 and so you're going to swing behind me, aren't you? And Keating saying, well, hang on a minute here. But then when Hawke does essentially deposed Hayden, Hayden resigned, but he saw the writing on the wall, and they find themselves in office, and by the time they actually have their first day in government, Keating knows, Hayden had made him Shadow Treasurer just a few weeks before the election was announced, and so he's only just starting to come to grips with the idea of that whole formidable economics brief that you have to carry largely in your head as a politician on the hustings. And suddenly he's in an election campaign endeavouring to present himself as somebody who knew everything there was to know about economics, matched against John Howard, who'd been Treasurer for 5 years. And he knew on that first day that Bob Hawke was already having misgivings and had sounded out the prospect of handing the Shadow Treasury, and therefore the Treasury now, back to Ralph Willis and away from Keating. And so Keating and Richardson, between them, headed that one off at the pass. But so you'd think that was, not the basis of a great start to their relationship, but Keating acknowledges that Hawke was actually very generous in those first few months in being a sounding board, giving advice. I mean, frankly, it was in the interests of Hawke and the government to make sure that Keating was going to be a safe pair of hands in Treasury. But for instance, Hawke invites Keating along for his first visit to the White House. And so Keating's sitting in there in meetings with Reagan, and he realises that, the Australian Treasurer, it was probably the first time an Australian Treasurer had sat in on a meeting with a US President and an Australian Prime Minister. So in that first year, or that first 18 months, as Keating describes it, in the old Parliament, Hawke's office was almost immediately, it was immediately above Keating's. And Keating would talk about wearing a path between the two offices. And they'd share cigars together. And I said, I didn't realise you'd ever smoked. He said, oh, well, I'd have an occasional cigar, because Hawke was an inveterate cigar smoker. And lots of conversations, and they were genuinely close. This was certainly Keating's perspective. And he's at pains to try and put it down as fact that for the 8.5 years of their partnership in office, that for the vast bulk of that time they operated as a very efficient political and policy partnership, and that there was this other interesting curve, which was, you might say, the sort of emotional relationship between them. They had a fallout over tax policy in '85. They had a fallout over Keating's brain snap on the Banana Republic in '86. They had a bit of an argument over the timing of the '87 election, but then they had a huge falling out over the '88 budget, and subsequently the Kirribilli Agreement came from that, which Hawke then reneged on after the Placido Domingo speech, and we can come to all of these things depending on the time, Laura, but he would maintain, even though he's also happy to say that after '84, when Hawke had that emotional upheaval in the family over his daughter Roz's heroin addiction, and she was pregnant, going to have the baby, and the child's health was in jeopardy as well as Roz's. And again, many of you may remember Hawke breaking down in a press conference at that time, different issue, but it was related. And as Keating tells it, Hawke also broke down and cried in a formal head of government to head of government meeting with Mahathir of Malaysia, of all people, and Keating was present, and Hawke broke down. So there was no doubt that he was seriously emotionally affected by that as a parent, for which I'm sure most people would have great sympathy. But Keating's contention is that something, a kind of a light went out of Hawke at that point, that he did slump into depression, and people argue about how long that slump lasted. Some say weeks. Hawke himself says it was a matter of weeks. Others say months. Keating says that not that he was kind of clinically depressed for the rest of his prime ministership, he wouldn't be silly enough to say that, but that his nurturing of the cabinet and of the government suffered, and that in that sense Keating filled a vacuum. So with that exception, he argues that for the bulk of that relationship it was a very productive one, and mostly one of friendship.
That's true, but once again, the warrior side of the personality was basically completely poisonous about him, about Hawke on many occasions.
No. I'll only speak from my own personal experience. I don't think Keating was a great leaker. Certainly wasn't my experience. I think he was a briefer.
Yeah, I'm talking subsequently.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean after it was all over?
Yeah.
Oh well, I think you can look and you can see. I mean, one thing I think it would have taken him a long time to forgive Hawke bringing out his autobiography as Keating is struggling to sustain Labor in office, and Hawke had a number of not thinly veiled but frontal attacks on Keating at a fairly important time in their government. Hawke, I think, damaged his relationship with a number of his former Labor colleagues at that time. But there was a point in the kind of early to mid 2000s where there was a sense of rapprochement between them, and then Blanche Del Puget brought out her updated version of her original biography of Hawke, which again included a number of things that Keating took great offence at, and I think that was the point where it was all bets were off. And in fact, if it hadn't been for Blanche's book, I don't think my television series with Paul Keating would have happened, and nor would this book. I think that whatever hunger he had to see his place in history told from his perspective, he certainly had that hunger after that book came out.
So, just continuing on, just to finish the point about Hawke.
Yes.
Despite all of that, when the leadership, I mean, he basically says, I end up having to tear him down, and I regret that he had to go out that way.
Yes.
And he talks about being in the caucus room when the vote was there, and the crushing weight falling on him.
The crushing weight falling on him, and also, I think, a sense of sadness about Hawke. Now, if you're going to be cynical about politics and politicians, I'd say, well, OK, there are moments where cynicism is deserved. I'd rather see a healthy scepticism than cynicism, but I'll concede you a bit of that. But I'm prepared to be open to the possibility that Keating felt genuine regret and possibly even sorrow, not just about the way he came to power, but for Hawke. He looked at this guy who had to be torn down in the end, and thought, well, what a sad way after the legacy that you've built in a way.
Some people who've been close to him have even suggested it went as far as a bit of guilt about Hawke.
Yeah, well, the political warrior would never acknowledge guilt.
Okay.
But one of the, I'm sort of laughing now because in our many conversations there'd be the ones where you'd come in. I mean, the way I did the television series, we would have a week that was dedicated to part one, and then we had a week that was dedicated to parts 2 and 3, which were the Treasury years, and then we had a week that was dedicated to part 4, which was the Prime Ministership. And of that week, there were sort of 2 to 3 days of intense conversation. But particularly when I was doing similar things when we had our further conversations for the book, and there'd be a bit of a lapse in time between one conversation and the next, and you'd walk in for the next, and we'd have been talking about the relationship with Hawke, and he'd have finished, full of frustration and anger about how it had come to what it did and why did Hawke stay for so long. And then he'd start the next conversation by bringing you back and saying, look, I really want to stress, Kerry, that for the bulk of the relationship, it was a great friendship and a great partnership, and then there'd be a pause, and he'd suddenly think of one of the moments that had given him the shits, and off he'd go again.
Exactly.
So you could see the struggle still goes on today within Paul Keating about that relationship, and it's a real one.
Yeah. Let me just briefly ask you about one other relationship before we talk about Paul Keating Prime Minister, having sort of flicked right through the Treasury years. But that is about his relationship with Treasury.
Yes.
Because you referred to John Bunting before, you referred to his wanting to know about institutions. And this is the other thing. I mean, he's a politician who's always had these very institutional and structural views of power. And he tells this story in the book about the first time he has to go over to see Treasury under John Stone as this rookie treasurer, and he decides to go by himself. Yeah,
and John Stone was a somewhat hated figure in the eyes of a number of Labor people, and in fact there was a strong view amongst some of the senior Labor figures, and Mick Young was one of them, when they came to power in 1983, who wanted and assumed that one of Paul Keating's first acts would be to sack John Stone as the Treasury Secretary, and that was because Stone was regarded as one of the anti-Labor figures, and I'm not saying he was for a minute, but he was regarded by a number of the Labor people from the Whitlam era as one of those Treasury figures who were hostile to Labor. And again, I absolutely stress, I'm not suggesting this was John Stone, but there was one senior Treasury leak, at least in those years, who was leaking against Gough. And Stone, a very colourful figure, a kind of eccentric figure in his own right, and a very bright man, used to hold court often on a Friday night at the National Press Club over drinks, and for a senior public servant could quite often be blunt in his comments. The end result of a lot of this is that although Keating was very wary of him, he was not immediately of the view that he should sack him. But he was going to invite John Stone to prove himself in a Labor government as the fearless but non-partisan advisor on economics. And so he had inherited Ralph Willis's staff. He was so new to the shadow Treasury job and to the Treasury job that he had inherited Ralph Willis's staff because Willis had been the shadow treasurer for several years at least. And his senior economic advisor was a guy named John Langmore, who later became and was a member of the Left Caucus in Labor, later became a Labor member for Canberra. And as Keating tells it, on his first morning, he's about to go over to meet with the Treasury bureaucrats who Keating knew could make or break him if you don't carry your department with you, even if you are genuinely calling the shots. If you don't carry your department with you, look out. Ask Sir Humphrey Appleby. And so John Langmore appears at the doorway of Keating's office with his manila folder and says, "What time are we leaving?" And Keating says, "Well, actually, John, you're not coming. I'm going alone," which was a blow to Langmore. But what Keating said was, "I am the Treasurer and I'm going alone. I have a message for these guys and I want to hear what they have to say. I don't want them to see me coming with what they will see as the baggage of old Labor." And so he went and listened to what they had to say and told them that he expected them to faithfully serve the Labor government, not as yes men, and they just about all were men in those days, but with frank advice, but non-partisan. And so he actually, and he got Hawke's support on that, and he did have not so much a tempestuous relationship, but a very difficult relationship with John Stone over the next, I think, 18 months or so, until Stone finally had enough after one budget. It might have been the 84 or 85 budget, and Stone left. But I was really interested. It can sound dry, and there's a lot of journalists, even in the gallery today, who still haven't quite worked out how much worth there is. Laura is one who worked it out very early. There's a great deal of worth for a journalist and a great deal of gold to mine from understanding the public service and who its power brokers are and how that process works. And Keating had gone to the trouble of working that out. I was interested to understand his relationship with the two key institutions that he worked with. One, the Reserve Bank, and the other was Treasury itself, and how he worked with those senior figures. Stone was deeply uncomfortable with the fact that Keating at times would lift the phone to some of Stone's deputies and have direct conversations with them, and Stone was always, I have the impression that Stone often found himself playing catch-up, but also the relationship that he forged with Bob Johnson, the Governor of the Reserve Bank. And when they floated the dollar, what they essentially were doing was breaking an old tradition where Treasury was the senior partner and the dominant force in the economic debates that took place behind the government walls on economic policy, and they became, if not equal partners, actually separate entities. where the Reserve Bank became an institution in its own right. And I was interested in the relationship, as Keating describes it, that developed between he and Bob Johnson. And I'm not so much concerned about who was first to put up the idea of the float. That can get boring and a bit eye-glazing. But what I was interested was hearing how he and Johnson went about establishing a kind of form guide, if you like, a roadmap towards floating the dollar, which was a massive, doesn't sound exciting from the outside, but it was a massive step for any government to take, with huge implications into the future, not least the beginnings of the deregulation of the economy.
Sure. So just, I'm keeping
Yep.
so
Keep me honest.
I'm not keeping you honest. I'm just. We've got so much to talk about still. And the book has got, I think, is really interesting because it also reflects this robustness of the relationship, shall we say, between Keating and the econocrats.
Yes.
It waxes and wanes, and you get a great value from the tension in that relationship. I'm going to move us on to Mabo.
Yes.
And I think the interesting thing here, or a particularly interesting thing here, is, what Mabo told us about using power and about
Yes.
bringing together. What does that mean? I mean,
Well, first of all, 1992. Keating is struggling as Prime Minister. The government he inherits is languishing in the polls. Its popularity figures were somewhere around the bottom of where Labor were, with Gillard and Rudd in their worst moments, and where Abbott was certainly headed when he was beheaded. And in the middle of 1992, Keating, struggling to lift his own personal credibility out of the mire of the recession as his Prime Minister, and he's got to try and persuade the Australian voters to elect a fifth Labor government. So, the tiredness of incumbency, the anger of the recession, the depth of that recession, he's got to try and come up with a blueprint that allows him to have a chance of persuading Australians that, having led them into that recession, he can lead them out of it. And then but at the same time, he's trying to offer them a new blueprint for leadership. He wants to show he's more than just the guy with the abacus and no heart, that he actually does have a heart and a vision for the future direction of repointing the raft, as he put it, towards Australia's future in Asia. Standing proud as a nation in our own right, as a republic, as he put it. Setting up a new architecture and a new framework for Australia in the Pacific through the Apec leaders' meetings, which he, in fact, quite rightly can claim ownership for. And then fourthly, the nation's relationship with its Indigenous people. So in the middle of 1992, as he's struggling and the economic figures are refusing to do what he wants them to do as a part of this blueprint he's established called One Nation. Before Pauline Hanson. And in June of 92, the High Court judges land on his doorstep their Mabo ruling, which, as he says now, he could have left to take its course through the courts, which would have been a legal and ultimately political nightmare, but mostly a legal nightmare with no great outcome necessarily for Indigenous Australians. And he decided that he was going to actually accept the challenge of Mabo and put the Mabo ruling into legislative effect, give it a legislative framework with a parliamentary stamp of authority. And the first real inkling of that, I think, was the Redfern speech. So here he is. His election is coming up in March the next year. He's had some wins against. He's had the psychological victory, established his psychological supremacy over John Hewson in the Parliament, but certainly not in the electorate. And the polls were going up and down, up and down. Labor would bring it so you'd see Labor come back into the game and then they'd slump again. And there were very few people anywhere, including inside his own party, that really believed Keating could pull off the 93 election. So you think about this in the context of today's politics. I don't believe there was a single vote in Mabo for Paul Keating, but in that framework, in the shadow of the 93 election, he made the Redfern Address. And in that Redfern Address, he says that we have to front up to what we, white Australia, did to Indigenous Australians. And he listed the litany. And it wasn't about guilt, but it was about accepting and acknowledging a reality as a starting point for a future relationship which he believed, and frankly I believe, is core to this nation if we are ever to regard ourselves as a nation of merit and of worth. But in doing that, he talks about leadership in this regard, and he says, I always believed that you should burn up the capital as you run to the poll rather than conserving it, being Mr. Safe Guy. A seminal issue like this and its remedy provide the uplift that any political personality needs. Doing what is right and good. It gives you the surge, and without the surge, what are you? You're just mucking around with tricky press statements and fleeting appearances at doorstops.
Sounds a bit too familiar these days, doesn't it?
And there are many other quotes like it. I think there's another one from that period where he talked about it's the leader's job to paint the new horizons. I put to him at one point, I quoted Neville Wran to him. Neville Wran was a very successful Labor leader in New South Wales. And I quoted Wran's comment to him about, Wran said once, it doesn't do, in terms of economic reform, in terms of reform generally, to be a reformist government, it doesn't do to get too far ahead of the mob. And Keating did not miss a beat. He said, I despise those comments. I despise that kind of attitude. That is not what I am about. And so there are many flanks on which you can be critical of Paul Keating. And you can argue the toss, as I said, about his policy. But I don't think you can doubt the genuineness of his desire not only to have leadership but to do something with it. And I think there are a number of lessons in this book about leadership that could be applied today.
Sure. So I'm just going to take you to page 489, Kerry.
Page 489. I remember it well.
Yes. And of course, one of the other things he did was Apec, which left a lot of people's eyes glazed. But this is another reflection on using power, and it reflected Keating's obsession with making us part of Asia. And there's this wonderful, I mean, one of the most fascinating things to me about the book is his description of other leaders, and and here is somebody who really understands what power is about, talking about getting other people who are very powerful to do what he wants. So he's going around the region trying to get all of these leaders to now come to a leaders' meeting. Until now it's just been, finance ministers and things like that. And he has to go and see the Chinese. Maybe you could just read that paragraph.
Yeah.
Or two.
So he's already half-Duchessed Suharto. He's introduced Suharto, who's been the leader of the non-aligned world for a long time and the leader of the biggest Muslim nation in the world, but the non-aligned nations. And so Suharto has not been an international statesman as such. So he persuades Suharto to a degree to the idea of being a part of an Asia-Pacific Leaders' Summit. It had been, as Laura said, this economic forum which Bob Hawke had started, to give credit to him, which was on the way to becoming a relatively important forum, but it was only at ministerial level. Keating wanted to raise it, and he'd started by selling it to George Bush Senior, who had actually come to Australia to meet Bob Hawke, but only 9 days before, Keating had usurped Hawke, and so Bush knocks on the door of Kirribilli House and it's opened by Paul Keating. So he starts by, could have played it safe with Bush and done the, we had a full and frank exchange on matters of mutual blah, 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 usual diplomatic crap. He took it on himself to introduce this entirely new idea to Bush. Bush says, yeah, look, sounds like an interesting idea, but why don't you go and try and sell it to a few other people around your region first and then come back to me? So he goes to Suharto. He's got Suharto half in the bag, and Suharto says, well, if you can get Miyazawa, who was the Prime Minister of Japan, then I'll come along. So he goes to Miyazawa, who he knew somewhat as when they were treasurers together, and he sells. So he gets up Miyazawa to the point where Miyazawa says, well, if you can get Suharto in the bag, I'll come on board. So he says, right, done. And he then goes to Li Peng, the Premier of China, and this is the passage. China was the next step with Li Peng. God, was he a tough guy, says Keating. He wasn't going to have a bar of it because Hong Kong and Taiwan were already part of the Apec ministerial round. China couldn't stomach the suggestion that this gave Hong Kong and Taiwan formal recognition of their independence from mainland China. At my dinner with Li Peng, he said, we won't be there. I said, listen, you'll be there. What? The President of the United States is going to be there? The Prime Minister of Japan? But you're not going to be there? I said, you'll be there. A Chinese leader is not used to being spoken to like this. His wife said, Mr. Keating, please have some respect for my husband. He's recuperating from a heart attack. So I got a rebuke from the wife and I had to tone it down. So he and his officials retire and they work out, how are we going to get past this business of Hong Kong and Taiwan, which was a fundamental sticking point. So they just do a little bit of tricky changing of terms. So instead of it becoming the formal leaders' summit, they changed it to a leaders' meeting. They were going to call it the heads of government meeting, and they changed it to a leaders' meeting. So he goes back into Li Peng the next day and comes up with that, and after a certain amount of deliberation, or as he would call it, arm wrestling, it took a while to get Li Peng on board. But at one point he gets Bush halfway there, and then Bush loses the 92 election to Bill Clinton. He's got to start all over again with Clinton. And because Clinton had said to the Americans, this election is about the economy, stupid, talking to Bush, he felt that his effort had to be seen to be about getting the domestic economy right, and I can't engage myself in some big newfangled international thing. So he and Keating put their heads together and they establish a relationship, and Keating and together they decide that they can sell it. It's a kind of a leaders' meeting, but it's a leaders' meeting about economics. And so Clinton says, well, can we have the first one in Seattle, which is the head of Boeing and the head of Microsoft, and we can make it all about jobs, jobs, jobs. But at one point, backwards and forwards on the phone, and at one point Keating says, I said to Clinton, listen, I got Li Peng in a headlock, but I need your authority on this. I need you to be seen to come to the next stage. So what I wanted in our conversations was to get to that kind of level of understanding of what can go on and what really does go on behind closed doors in these big power talks, because they managed to reduce it to such boring language by the time they emerge into their public, no matter what ugly shirts they're wearing, and you become preoccupied with the picture opportunities and not what has really gone on behind the scenes.
Yeah. And I'd really thoroughly recommend for those who sort of went, oh, Apec, that looks boring, just read it. It's a sensational part of the book. Now we're running
particularly in Osaka, which is the third of the ministerial meetings, and Clinton doesn't turn up for this one because by this stage Gingrich has got Clinton in a headlock, and the budget has been frozen, and he's got all kinds of diabolical trouble at home, and so he insults the Japanese, who are the hosts, by not coming, but he also insults Paul Keating, and when Al Gore turns up as the vice president, Keating gives you an earful about why Clinton should have been there. So what Keating didn't know, and Keating recalls that Gore says to him at the end of this little delivery, he says to him, well, "Well, Paul, you make me feel like the skunk at the wedding." goes back and reports it to Clinton, and it's recorded by an American historian who writes a book called The Clinton Tapes years later, Taylor Branch. And Clinton is having these secret fortnightly or monthly meetings with Taylor Branch, has one where he recounts Gore reporting back to him how Gore had been excoriated at Osaka by Paul Keating.
Now, tragically, we're getting very short of time. So, I think one of the other really fascinating features of this book is the way Keating sort of withdraws into rich policy veins like Apec and Mabo, and comes out of being quite so much the political warrior. But obviously, you read this book, or I certainly read it, and there's this clanging bell, clang, clang, clang. What's happening now? And particularly going back to 1992, to me there seem to be so many parallels between the job facing Paul Keating when he takes over from Hawke in 1992, in December 1991, and what was facing Malcolm Turnbull when he took over from Tony Abbott last year.
I think there's a... Look, like Paul Keating, Malcolm Turnbull faced a tough situation in the opinion polls when he took over. When he took over from Tony Abbott. But what everyone in Australia knew who didn't have his or her head in the sand or somewhere else would have seen that the mere fact of replacing Tony Abbott was going to see a spike in the popularity for the Liberals. Keating had to actually earn his, so that is one difference. But nonetheless, this is a tricky year for Malcolm Turnbull for different reasons. But I think there is a fundamental parallel, and it's this: you don't wait until you get through your first election to be seen to be doing things, and to be seen to be doing things. The point at which you are being judged by history, I believe, as a political leader, is the point at which you go to Government House and get sworn in. And I was prepared to give Malcolm Turnbull some room, as I think many, many Australians were. And like many other Australians, I breathed a sigh of relief at the, the boil being lanced. Which has nothing to do with preferring one side of politics over another. I think Australia had got itself into a very bad space at that point. So I think Malcolm Turnbull has come to the Prime Ministership with a great deal of goodwill, but not necessarily within his own party. There were 30 Liberals who voted for Kevin Andrews to be the Deputy Leader to Malcolm Turnbull. So that suggested immediately to me that there were 30 somewhat intransigent people who wanted to deliver Malcolm Turnbull a message that he had far from a blank cheque as the new Prime Minister. And so it has proved to a degree. But I don't think at the same time, and I'm not suggesting that he has become the captive of those 30 people or whatever that represents. But I think that in many ways they have been seen to lose their way. You're seeing that reflected in cartoonists.
But is the point here, if you're drawing the comparison, going back to what Keating says repeatedly in the book, is that you don't have a moment to lose?
You don't have a moment to lose, and I think you've got to be prepared to earn the respect of the voters from the outset. You can't say, well, just give me some time to get... I have to go through some tricky manoeuvres until I win the next election, and then you'll see the real Malcolm Turnbull. I think that's a very hard act to pull off. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is a very hard act to pull off. And I think that already there are signs of lack of cohesion between the between the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. you're still seeing the sniping on the sidelines, and I think you're seeing real confusion in the ranks. And I mean, really, Bill Shorten, say this gently as I can, Bill Shorten should be easy meat.
So, speaking of not having a moment to lose, we have no more moments to talk, tragically. So could I thank you, and could you join me in thanking Kerry O'Brien?
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you. Thank you.